So today we're going to do the first part in a three-part series where I'm going to rank the roster construction of all of the VCT teams. Now, I did this a couple months ago when the teams were a bit more in flux, but now we have a pretty solid idea for most of the teams, not all of them, but for most of the teams we have a pretty solid idea of what's going on, so I thought it was a good time to revisit this topic. Now we're going to start today with the Americas League, and then we're going to do the other two leagues over the next couple days, and we're going to start with three teams that are embroiled in a kind of weird game of chicken, e.g. 100 Thieves and NRG, because many of you may know the EG are a bit of a mess. So right now, if you look at EG's team on VLR, hey look, I recognize those faces. That's the team that won Champions 2023. We all remember that team, but some of you also may remember some of the rumors that we've heard about EG in these past couple months, that the org is basically dying. They might not even be in esports. They might not even exist. Right, we don't even know at this point if there will be 11 teams in VCT Americas, which is kind of interesting, let's just put it that way. And as a part of that, of course, there is heavy rumors that this team is breaking up. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this EG game of chicken. For those of you who don't know, both NRG and 100 Thieves have rosters that are not complete right now. And the theory is that those teams are just waiting for the contracts for these players to run out so that then they can just, take them without needing to pay a buyout to EG. And then that's going to be that. And we have no idea what will happen to EG. Now, again, for this tier list, what I am basing this off is kind of where your old roster from the end of last year was. What does it look like now? And, what do I think about that, right? That's what this tier list is. Obviously, the ideal for EG would have just been to keep everyone together, but it seems like that almost certainly won't happen, even though kind of theoretically right now it kind of technically is, right? That seems like it won't happen, and so EG, some of you may have seen it, they're just going to go in the EG tier because I have no idea if they'll even be in the esport. And now let's take a look at 100 Thieves. And 100 Thieves have made some changes that we know about. They got rid of Stella and Derek, and they've brought in EU from M80. And they played in Red Bull Homeground, and they had Nature there kind of as a sub, but kind of potentially on a trial basis, kind of weird, interesting. But the theory is, the rumor is that 100 Thieves will be picking up Boostio to come and play for them, when his contract expires with EG, and Boostio's kind of made some little comments and stuff that makes it seem like he will be playing for 100 Thieves. So with that in mind, let's take a look at this team, which would then be Bang, Cryocells, EU, Asuna, and Boostio. Now, coming from where 100 Thieves were at the end of last year, obviously their season ended with that crazy knife kill, it did seem like changes obviously had to be made, and they have made some changes. However, I like that they haven't maybe completely blown everything up. You've still got 3 of the 5 players. Mike's is still there as an assistant coach now, but you have made some changes, right? You have brought in potentially a new IGL, right? A new player in EU, a new head coach, right? That's, I think, about the right level of change for 100 Thieves if I were in charge of them. And so for that, I'm going to put 100 Thieves in the A tier. I think they've made some good changes. I'm still not fully convinced that it might, work out perfectly, but I kind of like the direction they're going in. Now let's come to NRG's VLR page, which is very funny because they've only got 2 players. And you might notice that Valorant is a 5-player game, so 2v5 probably not looking great. And obviously they got rid of Artist, they got rid of FNS, and Som they've left as well. And obviously the season ended in a pretty embarrassing way, you might say, for NRG, right? Losing to Billy twice in a row, and the second time they played, like, Billy just looked like the way better team than NRG, right? It wasn't even particularly that close. So not a great ending to the season. So making these changes probably makes sense. I think everyone could kind of predict Artist going. Obviously, Som had a really good year last year, which, it doesn't feel great for him to leave. But obviously the situation is kind of weird with FNS and Som, they're kind of, tied at the hip and whatever. And now they're kind of streaming together. So it kind of makes some sense, I guess. But now, what do NRG do from here? Well, again, the rumors are that they are going to pick up 2 EG players in Ethan and Demon 1, and that they're also going to pick up Marved. If that is the case, and if that is NRG's roster, then, that looks like a pretty stacked roster, right? In terms of, like, its firepower and whatnot. Looks pretty good on paper. It does have some questions, though, right? Like, who's going to be the IGL for that team? Maybe Marved, maybe Ethan, maybe we don't know. And also, I don't think they really have a recognized Sentinel player either. I guess Victor would probably do it if I had to guess, but, there is some questions there as well. And so for NRG, there's still some questions for me. I think in an ideal world, they might have just kept Som, right? Because he had such a good year. But Okay, if Som's gone as well, I think I'm going to put NRG in the B tier because there's just too much unknown right now with this team in terms of where they're actually going and will they actually sign those players or not. And then even if they do, there's still some questions. And now let's come to Sentinels, everyone's favorite team. And obviously, again, their VLR page has a lot of players here, but we kind of know what the team is actually going to be. It's going to be John QT, Tens, Sassy, Zekken, and Zelsis, not Pancada. And obviously that means we have seen some change, right? We saw John QT get brought in. Obviously now Zelsis, it seems like, has been brought in, and he's going to play over Pancada as well. And we've seen Sentinels play in a lot of these off-season tournaments and do pretty well. And I think, you know, they just won the AVL in that off-season tournament against some good teams like Paper Rex, you know, and DRX and whatnot. So that's pretty positive for them overall. And I think the thing I would say about Sentinels overall in terms of how they've played is they just look sharp. They look in kind of like a mid-season form where, you know, they seem to know what they're doing. Their reactions are very fast to things, whereas other teams, maybe you could tell, weren't reacting that quickly to other stuff that was happening in the games. So that's very positive for Sentinels. And obviously, if we think back to where Sentinels were, where they had Marv kind of IGLing for the team, and it felt kind of weird and disjointed, and obviously had all the changes at the start of the year after playing a couple games as well, and it felt kind of, what is going on? It feels now like, okay, things are maybe just a bit more settled in this squad. And of course, with Sentinels, there's always going to be some drama, and there was, of course, with who's playing between, you know, Zelsis and Pancada instead. But I think overall, and from what we've seen, it seems like they've settled into a good shell. You know, Zelsis seems like a great addition. John QT seems like a great addition. And so it looks to be trending upwards. I'm not going to quite put them in S tier, but I think overall I can put them in like high A tier just for how kind of good it's looked overall. Okay, now on to Cloud9, and this is the 5. We know their team. They've played in quite a few of the off-season tournaments themselves as well with this 5. And yeah, this is an interesting one, of course, because from where Cloud9 were, you know, last year, obviously things were very different. They changed their coach, they changed multiple of their players, and initially the reaction to this roster was, you know, that it's just not very good, right? A lot of people were pretty down on Cloud9 and what they were doing. They thought, like, you know, this is them basically just cheaping out and, you know, getting a roster of players who maybe, you know, aren't good enough or whatever. But then having played in some of these off-season tournaments, they look pretty good, right? They looked like a team that was decent, to be honest. And maybe that has changed that expectation of Cloud9 and what we can expect, because it did look fairly decent when these players were playing together. But for me, when I look at this team, you know, we have to think about back what was Cloud9 before, right? And okay, they let go of Rooney, which I think most people could kind of maybe see was coming, particularly with some kind of weird rumors around LCQ. You know, they changed MCE, a very good coach that a lot of people respect, right? And then they've let go of Leaf and Zelsis, who have now gone to other teams and have both proven themselves, and Zelsis is just proving it even more now in Sentinels, that as soon as he comes into the team of Sentinels just looks a lot better. And so for me, for Cloud9, sure, they didn't make it to an international tournament, but I'm not sure if this roster is an actual upgrade over what they had previously, because I have pretty high hopes for Leaf and Zelsis doing pretty well in this upcoming season, and so I'm gonna put them in the C tier. Okay, next up we have G2, and this is a bit of a weird one, to be honest, because obviously the old G2 team basically doesn't exist, because this team just bought their way into the tier 1 league, essentially, you know, buying essentially the guard, and then just bringing in Leaf as well from Cloud9. And when this team was initially constructed, I think a lot of people had pretty high hopes, but they did play in some off-season tournaments and didn't look great. I'm not going to put too much stock into the off-season tournaments, of course, but you know, it did put a bit of a question mark, like, ooh, I thought, you know, maybe this team, the guard plus Leaf, you know, could have beaten this team or whatever, right? When they didn't. And so maybe it just raised some questions of like, oh, I wonder how good this team will actually be. And the guard before that, of course, have had some kind of weird peaks and valleys, you might say, right? They won. They were literally the winners of NA and went to Masters Reykjavik and then crashed out and then couldn't make it to any other internationals. And then, you know, ended up in tier 2 and then ended up winning tier 2, you know, and now they're coming into tier 1 and it's like, how will they do? So there definitely is some questions here, but in terms of their roster construction, obviously for G2, it's kind of a weird one doing this anyway, because essentially they just bought another team. So for G2, I'm going to do something a bit weird here. I'm going to put them in the S tier because essentially they bought their way into tier 1 by buying this team. So that's a good move. That's like a good way of doing things. And then Leaf is also a good player. So even if it doesn't work out, you know, G2 essentially just bought a slot in the league, which is probably a good investment. And now on to Loud, who made one of the biggest off-season changes, you might say, where Aspas is gone and they bring in QCK here, and they've also changed their head coach as well. Now, Obviously, Aspas is one of the best players in the world, and when one of the best players in the world leaves your team, you're not really going to be able to replace one of the best players in the world that easily, right? QCK, played for Furia last year, looked pretty decent. Obviously not at like Aspas levels, but a decent, good player. Obviously, when we compare this to like the ideal for Loud, the ideal for me would have just been keeping it together, right? They had a very young team other than Sadek, so to me, if they could have, just had this whole year of development where they ended up finishing third in champs, there's a lot of question marks coming in, for Loud at the start of the year, but having a second place finish at Lock-in and third place at champs, then running it back, I think if Loud had kept the same team, most people would probably say that the favorites to win Americas, they're probably up there with Fnatic as like probably the second favorite maybe to, win all the events essentially. So I think overall, I'm gonna put Loud in the C tier, I guess, because Aspas is just that big of a loss, right? And I don't think anyone expects Loud to be as good as they would have been with Aspas. And it's not that QCK is a bad player, but you just can't replace someone that good. Okay, now moving on to Leviatan, who have made some big changes themselves. They let go of Shy and Takalia, of course, and they bring in Tex and, of course, Aspas. Now, this team is now going to be coming in English. They've also changed their coaching staff, so there's quite a bit of change going on with Leviatan. And it's going to be interesting to follow this team, right? Because I think a lot of people have pretty high hopes for this team, right? Obviously bringing in Aspas, and they have been playing in some off-season tournaments and looked, pretty good from, some of the early reports. But at the same time, with so much change and changing what language are coming in and all of that, like maybe there's a chance as well things, don't go right. And, when you do get these kind of high expectation teams and things, start to fracture a bit, that can cause some big problems. And so for Leviatan, it's an interesting one, right? Obviously, the expectations are kind of pretty high, I would say, right now. I still do have some question marks, though, and I still think there's a possibility things don't go right. So I'm going to put them in the A tier, I think. It's not quite buying your way into VCT good, but, it's still pretty good. Okay, now on to Furia, and Furia have made quite a lot of changes. They got rid of their coach, Carlisle, they got rid of DG Zin, QCK, Mazin, they bring in Liazi and Havoc, and a new coach, and that's ended up with this roster. Now, I don't know a ton about Brazilian Tier 2 and whatnot to really give like a full-time definitive answer on how good these players are, but my question would be, is this better than the old roster, right? And I'm squinting and I'm going like, like my expectation is probably it'll be around the same kind of level. Obviously, you have to think like, hey, Brazilian team, Aspas was maybe available. Could we have got Aspas? That would have been nice. Maybe not, but there was possibilities there. And this team, looking at it, it's like they'll probably be okay, but I'm not sure, really how far they're gonna go. And so for Furia, they've made a ton of changes, but I'm not sure it's really made them that much better. So I'm gonna put them in the C tier as well. Okay, and now on to Mibr, and they've made some changes as well. They get go of Heat and Mariz. They bring in Mazin and Artzin and Fraud as a coach. Now, here's the thing. Again, I don't know a ton about Artzin and how good of a player he is, but Mazin was a pretty good player for Furia. But they've kept 3 of their 5 from last year who, let's face it, Mibr were not good last year. They just didn't do that well, and so I think I would have personally preferred to see maybe a bit more change. I do think that Fraud will help them. He's a very good coach, and I definitely think he will be a help. But I'm just not sure that it's going to be enough, to be honest. And I think I would have liked to have seen more change from a team that, to be honest, really struggled last year. So for Mibr, I really would have liked to have seen more changes, to be honest. So I'm going to put them at the top of the C tier. The reason they're going at the top of the C tier is pretty much because I think Fraud is a very good coach, and that's why they're in this top of C tier. And so for Crew, they've made a couple changes as well. They get rid of Nags and Akshedi. They bring in Shy and MTA and keep everything else, right? So they keep Melza, Kesnet, and Klaus. They bring in those players. They've kind of kept, I mean, I think you definitely would keep Melza and you'd keep Kesnet given their run through LCQ. Klaus was maybe a bit of a toss-up, right? But then the players that they brought in as well, don't know a ton about MTA. Shy is obviously a decent player. They have played in some of these off-season tournaments, but again, not reading too much into that, even though it didn't go great. This again is kind of like 100 Thieves, where the level of change I think probably makes sense for a team like Crew. And for Crew, I'm gonna end up putting them in the B tier for making, a couple solid changes. And so this is my America's tier list, and again, this is just another thing EG have ruined, because, you know, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on right now with EG and NRG and 100 Thieves, so it's all a bit of speculation. But we will be doing EMEA and Pacific, where there should be less speculation, because, you know, most of those teams have their house in order, unlike EG.